Okay, so welcome to this week's Information Studies 753, Preserving Information Media lecture. We'll be talking about ingest, really one of the most important aspects of digital preservation. So definitely a good topic to be aware of and to discover more thoroughly. Okay, so we've got just a couple of weekly topics for this week. We've got which activities occur during the ingest stage of digital preservation and which factors influence those activities. So we'll start by looking at some of the goals of ingest. So acquiring records that are easy to preserve, establishing a baseline of authenticity, protecting the authenticity of records, identifying records, collecting information about records, analyzing and appraising records, and making records accessible. So I have an asterisk next to a few of these because these to a great degree are going to depend on the ability of the archives to work with records donors ahead of time in order to make sure that these goals of ingest are achieved. So we'll talk more about this later on in the lecture. But yeah, generally speaking, you want to acquire records that are easy to preserve because things that are easy to preserve require less resources to preserve them in the long run, and that's usually very beneficial for archives. Establishing a baseline of authenticity allows you to develop a picture of the records and the different aspects of the record. And then you can go ahead and compare the record in the future with what the record looked like when it originally came into the repository. So it's difficult to know if a record has changed over time for whatever reason if you don't have an idea of what the record looked like either after it was created or after it came into the repository. So it's just important to get an understanding of what the record is like and the different characteristics of the record when they come into the archive so that you have something to compare with later on in the record's life. Kind of relatedly, you want to protect the authenticity of the records. Ideally, your ingest will be carried out in a way that doesn't result in the original record being changed. Although sometimes that may be inevitable if records are in a format that archives don't really have the ability to preserve long-term, then a migration or some other preservation act might be done to the records during ingest to make those records more accessible by the archives itself and by its researchers. So this one might be difficult for archives to meet 100% of the time. Identifying records, you just want to have a really good idea of what records are coming into the repository, usually in the form of some kind of manifest, which you can check later on, and we'll talk about that more as we move through the different stages of ingest. Analyzing and appraising the records, so looking at the records that you actually got from the donor and just kind of taking, ideally this is a second glance at the records and saying, are these records that we really want to invest in the future? Are these records that we can provide access to, that we can maintain long term? And if not, maybe we should get rid of them. So again, ideally, as we'll discuss later on, appraisal will take place prior to when the records come into the archive, but that's not necessarily or even commonly the case. And finally, making the records accessible. So the overall goal is to take records from a donor and make them accessible for researchers in the future. And there are a few different things that may go into making records accessible, a few different considerations that archivists have to make, and we'll touch on those during the lecture as well. So here is a generalized overview of the ingest process. So what might occur is some sort of pre-ingest appraisal. And so this is something that the DPC, I guess, excerpt or webpage that we read for this week talks about how ideally, before the records are even ingested by the archival repository, the archive should do some kind of appraisal. It may be based on the file format, it may be based on the archive's collecting policy. You know, there may be a bunch of other reasons, some of which we talked about when we discussed the connections between digital preservation and appraisal. But ideally, archives have some way to identify records that they want to bring into the archive prior to actually doing so. And that saves you the time and effort of having to bring in files that you're just going to get rid of eventually, because, you know, that's just kind of a waste of resources. So, you know, it's always good to be proactive and to think about how you can identify records that you want to ingest before you actually begin the ingest process. Next, we have the negotiation phase or stage, and that's followed by the transfer phase or stage, and then the ID and analyze phase or stage, and then finally the accessibility phase or stage. So again, the idea is to identify records that the archive wants to collect or perhaps has to collect, some kind of negotiation with the donor about exactly what the records will look like when they come into the archives, the physical transfer of the records from the donor to the archive, some follow-up identification and analysis of those records, maybe some additional appraisal, as I mentioned, and finally, the stage where the records are moved into storage for long-term preservation, and they are accessible to the archive's patrons. And so we'll go through these different stages one by one. I kind of touched on appraisal a little bit as a pre-ingest activity, but we'll focus on these next 4 stages really for the rest of the lecture. Okay, so we'll start with the negotiation stage. Some of the questions that an archive might ask during the negotiation stage are, how will the files be transferred? You know, are they going to be transferred online? Are they going to be transferred through some kind of physical media like a hard drive? Who is going to be responsible for the transfer? So is there a contact at the donating, you know, agency or organization that the archives will specifically work with? You know, that's always a good thing. Which formats in media will be accepted? So which types of files and which type of storage media is the archive willing to transfer or to transfer from? How can the records be changed? So are there, is there some flexibility about the ultimate format or structure of the records, or does the donor want, or does the donor require that the records remain in their original format? What can we learn about the records? So this is a good time to get some contextual information about the records, perhaps get some documentation about the records, perhaps make sure that as much contextual information about the records as possible is attached to the records and included with the records during the transfer. So which resources can we use? What does the archive have access to in order to make the transfer possible? And finally, what metadata are we collecting? So this kind of relates to what can we learn about the records? Exactly what metadata do we want to have attached to the records prior to transfer? What kind of technical information, administrative information do we want to have attached to these records? And how can we go about making sure that that happens? So really the whole goal of this negotiation stage is to determine exactly what the transfer is going to look like and how it's going to take place. But also it's a great opportunity for archives to find out as much as they can about the records themselves and to make sure that important documentation and metadata comes along with the records. And it's not just the content, but the context that archives are tasked with preserving as well, which is something that we have discussed throughout this class. But again, you always have to kind of place this within the means and the resources of the archive. So, maybe you don't even have the resources to negotiate with donors or with departments or offices within your institution. That's unfortunate, but it might be the case. So you just have to kind of scale your negotiation with the resources that you have to bring to bear. Okay, so next we'll connect it with a few of our aspects of digital preservation and a few other processes that archives engage in. So we can connect negotiation with appraisal. So one thing that archives might consider when appraising records is how much negotiation are we going to be able to do? Does it seem like the person is really open to having a negotiation phase and really hashing out the details of what the transfer is going to look like? And are they open to suggestions about what file formats the records are in? Or does it seem like they just kind of want to do their own thing and they don't really have the time or interest in working with us? That might make an archives decide, well, this person isn't really being helpful, they're not really cooperating, so that makes us less interested in actually acquiring their records. And generally speaking, the more negotiation takes place and the more collaborative this process is, the easier it's going to be for archives to provide access to the records, because they are going to be getting records that are in file formats that are easier for the archives to preserve. They're going to have more information about the records, and that can help access, and it can just benefit the access to records by researchers, generally. Obviously, negotiation involves a form of collaboration between the archives and the donor, so there's a link to collaboration as well. Again, sustainability, archives have to negotiate within their means. They can't spend all of their time negotiating with potential donors. They have to kind of place that in context with other aspects of digital preservation and other activities that the archive needs to carry out. But I think you can make the argument that having a good negotiation process take place, again, can allow archives to acquire records that are easier to preserve in the long run, and that can increase in archive sustainability because they're not spending as much resources doing things that they wouldn't have to do if this negotiation process really took place. Okay, so I touched on the connection between negotiation and appraisal. Outreach. If an archives has a good relationship with a donor or a good relationship with other departments or offices within their institution, then those individuals may be more likely to engage in this negotiation process. If they feel like the archives are important, if they value the archives, then they may be more willing to take time to work with the archives and hash out what the transfer is going to look like, hash out what kind of information the archives needs, hash out what kind of file formats work best for the archives, and that can really, again, help the negotiation process go more smoothly, and that can be beneficial for the overall preservation and accessibility of the records that are being transferred to the archives. Records management. So it may be that a record schedule dictates that records are transferred in a certain file format. So that may limit the scope of the negotiation. I don't really see too many other connections between negotiation and records management. Processing. If archives are able to negotiate the inclusion of documentation and metadata with records as opposed to just the content, that can make the arrangement and description of records a lot easier because archives will already have this metadata. And as we've talked about before, sometimes the metadata is really all that's needed for a description. But if that metadata doesn't exist because the archives were unable to secure its inclusion during this negotiation process, then that's going to make it more difficult for archives to arrange and describe records in the future. It may be that the archives can create metadata once the records have come into the archives, but again, that's just kind of an extra step that wouldn't have to take place if the metadata was included prior to transfer. Okay, so one other connection that I'll make is between negotiation and documentation. And this is something that the DPC website mentioned, was that much of the detail on the negotiation phase should be documented in policies that the archive or the institution as a whole has. So an archives may have preferred file formats guidelines or something like that, or other forms of documentation which will really spell out exactly what the archive wants and what the archive needs. And then rather than have to renegotiate this every single time, the archives can just say, well, here's our policy, and at least be hopeful that the donors are going to adhere to what the policies say. Having a policy doesn't necessarily mean that a policy is going to be followed. Again, getting back to outreach, if the donor has a good relationship with the archives, it's maybe more likely that the archives policies and other forms of documentation about the transfer of electronic records will be followed, but it's definitely not a given. But you certainly can refer to the documentation and policies that archives have when they are when this negotiation is taking place. And of course, metadata is an important form of documentation, and that's something that archives may ask to be included with records when they are transferred as well. So all kinds of connections here. Okay. So the next process that we'll look at is, you guessed it, the transfer of the records. So this is when the records actually move from physical custody by the donor / creator of the records to the archive itself. So some questions you might ask here: which records are present? So which records are actually included on this hard drive? Which records are included in you know, Dropbox or whatever tools are used to transfer records online, you know, what are we actually getting? Another question is, how can we protect against viruses? So the Velt article talked about having a virus scan as a part of their kind of transfer procedure. So that's something that archives will want to consider. How can we protect it against unwanted changes to the record? So again, you don't want to have the records changed and have the authenticity of the records undermined. So you want this transfer process to occur with as few changes to the record as possible. So on page 5, when Velt talks about using a standalone workstation with write blockers, that essentially means that when the records are on that workstation, the records aren't going to be changed. There aren't any programs or anything else that is going to unintentionally change the files. And again, this goes back to ideas of authenticity and wanting to preserve that as much as possible during this transfer process. So how can we validate the integrity of files? So again, a connection to authenticity. You want to make sure that you're able to determine the integrity of file formats, do things like fixity checks, just to make sure that that the records that you're getting are valid and that they are, again, as authentic as possible. So kind of related to which records are present, how can we validate the manifest? So how can we make sure that the records that are being transferred are ones that are contained in a manifest provided to the archives by the donor? So just making sure that if the donor says you're getting this and this and this, then that's actually what you got. So which transfer options can we consider? So this is something that the DPC website has a really good kind of breakdown of. So, you know, just looking at different options for transfer, some of them were really focused on types of transfers that were especially beneficial in the long run. And those are ones that archives should really be focused on, because again, the idea is that you're going to be preserving these records in the future. And so you really want to focus on having transfer options that are beneficial, you know, into the indefinite future. And again, this is something that you're going to have to negotiate with the donor or creator of the files. And some of these, again, are going to affect authenticity. So if you just say, you know, we're going to accept all options, we're going to accept any kind of file format or any kind of hardware, then that may result in you getting records that are most authentic because they'll be sort of in their most authentic or original form. But that might be difficult for you to preserve and provide access to in the long run. So your records may be authentic, but if you can't provide access to them in a sustainable way, then, you know, are you really doing yourself and your researchers a favor? So for example, the DPC website lists limiting the range of media received as the most cost-effective long-term option because, you know, there are some types of physical media that are easier to access than others. So obviously it's easier to access, you know, an external hard drive than it is a 3.5-inch floppy disk. So you might say, okay, we're not going to take 3.5-inch floppy disks. And, you know, long term, that might be a better choice for you. The DPC lists accept and store as received as the least cost-effective option long-term despite lower initial costs. So if you just say, we're going to take everything in and just kind of hold on to it, obviously that isn't going to cost you a lot of resources up front. But again, as you struggle to preserve and provide access to these things in the future, you're going to end up spending those resources eventually anyway. So it's just important to look at all these different options as far as what the transfer will look like and what kind of media and formats you'll accept, and just kind of weigh the long-term pros and cons of that. And I think the DPC website does a good job of describing what some of those short and long-term repercussions might be. So which resources can we use? So the Veld article talks about a couple of different tools that they used, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. Again, I mentioned the Veld article talking about having a standalone workstation with write blockers and hardware to transfer files from various storage media. So that is a resource that the archives would require. I think the article mentioned they had to write a grant to get those resources, and writing grants takes time too. And they also needed safe and adequate storage to store the materials in as well. That's something more for later stages of the ingest process, but it's something that might be a consideration during the initial transfer phase, especially if records are particularly, especially if collections are particularly large. So again, what metadata are we collecting? As we're transferring records, are we collecting additional technical metadata? Are we making sure that we're collecting fixity information and really, again, attempting to verify that the records aren't being changed unintentionally and that we actually have all the records that we were expecting to get. So to talk about the Veld article a little bit more, so they talked about they got the records from the donor, then they used data accessioner and Droid to transfer the files and to produce metadata about the files, and then they transferred the records to that standalone workstation that I talked about. So, again, that's the transfer process, just getting the records from the donor, ideally using various tools to make sure that the records haven't changed when they're being transferred, which is what the data accessioner did, and then developing metadata for the records using Droid, and then keeping all that information with the records in the workstation, and then doing things like virus checks, maybe some validation of manifests, and getting the records ready for long-term preservation. Okay, so to connect these with some of the aspects of digital preservation and some of the other processes that archives engage in, authenticity. So, I talked about before about how you want to prevent the records from being changed during the transfer process, because that can undermine the authenticity of records. Documentation, again, developing metadata about the records as they're being transferred. And the Veld article talked about using Droid for that. Also, what you do during your transfer is something that really should be spelled out in documentation that your archives has creates about exactly what your preservation actions are going to be and what the different processes for them are. So everything should proceed according to a documented policy that your archives has developed and actually follows. Sustainability, again, a standalone workstation isn't free. Having the media to having the hardware to pull things off of media that might be kind of obscure or difficult to access isn't free. This takes time from your staff. So, you have to think about that when you're transferring records and when you're developing your transfer policies. Data accessioner and Droid are free, so those are good tools to use as far as sustainability goes. There may be transfer tools out there that aren't free, so you just kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of those as well. Connections to outreach, maybe not a ton that I can think of off the top of my head. Appraisal, you might do some kind of rudimentary appraisal as you're transferring the records. If you are transferring the records and you see a bunch of duplicates or things like that, you can easily identify and say, okay, I don't want to, I don't even want to transfer these into storage, so I'm just going to get rid of them right away. So that might be something that you can think about doing. Records management, I'm not seeing a ton of connections off the top of my head. Processing, obviously, developing metadata during the transfer, if it hasn't been created already prior to transfer, that can be beneficial for your arrangement and description down the road. Okay. So next we'll talk about the ID and analyze stage. So this is when you've actually transferred the records to your repository, and now you have moved the records into to longer term storage. So, well, we'll talk about the Velt article in just a second, and it'll kind of hopefully clarify this a little bit. But some questions that you might ask during this stage. So again, how will we identify the records? Are there any privacy issues that might be present, and how are we going to find those? How will we decide which records to keep? So this is where you might do a more in-depth appraisal and really think about, okay, we've transferred all these records. Are these records that we necessarily want to store long-term? And if so, why? Maybe you've transferred records in a file format that might be difficult for you to use in the future. And, you say, okay, well, now that we kind of have these records in front of us, maybe these aren't the best records for us to keep, or, records that we're not really able to keep long-term. So ideally, as you move through this transfer process, you learn more about the records and what's actually in the records, and so that can give you grounds for more of an appraisal to take place. So again, thinking about what resources can we use, what tools do we have to do this identification and analysis, and again, what metadata are we collecting? So how are we making sure that we document what we see as we continue to identify and analyze these records? So in the Velt article, they talked about using Bagger, which is a tool that the Library of Congress created, and BitCurator to transfer the files to storage and then do additional identification of the records. So using some of the forensic tools within BitCurator, I think they mentioned bulk extractor, to get more information about the records in the form of metadata, and transferring the metadata and the files into long-term storage for for long-term preservation. So this is what the ID and analyze stage would look like. One thing that I thought was interesting and seems prudent is how the Velt article talked about once records get to this stage, only the archivist handles them and student workers no longer have access to the records, and they see that as a security step and something that they relate to the National Digital Stewardship Alliance's different levels of digital preservation. So it was nice to see that kind of practical wrinkle listed in that article. And, you know, it makes sense. Not that student workers are untrustworthy or anything like that, but maybe they may not have as much expertise as archivists have. So this might be a good point for more skilled professionals to take over and participate in this part of the ingest process. Okay, so how can we connect the ID and analyze stage to the different aspects of digital preservation and the different archival processes that we have discussed? So again, ideally, this identification and analysis really supports the idea of making the records accessible. So adding additional information, adding additional documentation about the records just supports their access and can really support an attestation to their authenticity as well. Collaboration. You may collaborate with other people that may know more about the records than you do when you do your continued appraisal of the records, which I mentioned as being a part of this stage. So you may get back in touch with the donor and say, hey, you know, we realize that these records are in this on this hard drive that you gave us. There's a lot of information here. You know, is there information on this hard drive that we should really focus on preserving, or, you know, do you think that we can get rid of some of this stuff? So just having a more informed perspective about the records during the appraisal process is probably a good thing to have. And again, sustainability, you know, using open source tools. BitCurator is maybe more of a house cat open source tool as opposed to a barn cat open source tool. So that can take a little bit more resources to get up and running. And you might have to collaborate with IT to get that going. So definitely collaboration with IT. So yeah, those are just some of the connections between this stage and some aspects of digital preservation. Connecting to outreach, IT may be more willing to help you develop things or implement things like BitCurator if you have a good relationship with them. Donors may be more willing to answer your appraisal questions if you have a good relationship with them. So that can certainly be beneficial. Not a lot of connections with records management that I can think of. Processing, again, the more metadata you have, the more you're able to create, the more you're able to use to arrange and describe the records, ideally in a pretty efficient and sustainable way. And so that's always a bonus. Okay, and then last but not least, we have accessibility. So kind of the final stage of the ingest process where you are seeking to make your records as accessible to the public as possible. So you might be thinking about how we determine how to provide access to our records. So This is going to be influenced by different restrictions on your record. So if you have records that you feel comfortable providing access to only in the reading room, then that's going to shape how you provide access to those records. If you have records that you feel comfortable placing online and just letting people download and do whatever they want with, then that is going to shape the accessibility steps that you take. So this can really be dependent on different records that are coming into your repository and different restrictions that might be placed on those records. You might also think about, can records be changed for greater accessibility? So again, can you migrate records into a format that is more accessible? And you may even keep the preservation copies in their original form or original formats, and create preservation copies, which you then migrate to a different format, which is more accessible. And then also thinking about, should your records be changed for greater accessibility? So it might be easier for you to migrate records for access, but if you feel like that's going to result in a loss of authenticity that really undermines the value of the records, then you might say, okay, migrating these records and putting them online is obviously easier for us, and it makes the records more accessible to researchers. But again, we feel like the loss of information or the change to the record would be so great that it's really not going to provide researchers with the type of record that they need in order to meet their research need. So that's just a debate that you have to consider. Again, the kind of never-ending debate between access and authenticity, which really permeates a lot of what digital preservation is about. So again, I don't have them included here for some reason, but obviously thinking about the resources that you have for accessibility and what kind of metadata you might collect is important as well. So if you do migrate records to a different format for accessibility purposes, then you want to make sure that you document that for future use. So, okay, so we'll wrap things up by comparing this accessibility stage to some of the aspects of digital preservation that we've talked about and some connections to other archival processes. So access, obviously, a lot of overlap there. Authenticity, again, the tension between access and authenticity that I talked about. Documentation, you want to document if you do migrate a record for accessibility purposes. Sustainability, again, you need to really keep in mind the resources that you have to do things like migrations or to provide access to records as they should be accessed. So if you have records that you really only feel comfortable providing access to in the reading room, then obviously you have to have some kind of workstation in your reading room for researchers to access those records on, right? So whatever access decisions you make, you need to have the resources to actually carry that out, or otherwise, how are people going to access the records? If you say, oh yeah, we have this, 3 terabyte collection, and we're just going to put it all online and let people look at it, well, okay, you have to have the resources to do that. So you have to have the storage to do that, right? So you have to put your money where your mouth is. Um, Looking at some connections with our archival processes, uh, outreach in order to have the resources that you need to make records as accessible as you would like. That's going to take resources, and your archive is not going to get resources without advocating for itself and justifying why it should exist. Appraisal, the fewer records you have, the easier it is to provide access to them. So the more scrupulous you are with your appraisal decisions, the fewer records you'll need to provide access to, and that can be beneficial to your archive. If records have a bunch of restrictions to them or legal concerns that will limit their accessibility, then that might be an appraisal consideration that you make, as well, as we discussed when we talked about the connection between digital preservation and appraisal last week. Records management may dictate what the accessibility of records is. So it may say a record schedule may say these records go to the archive but remain confidential. Okay, so that probably means that you're not supposed to, put them online and let, everyone and their cousin look at them, right? So that might be a connection with records management. Processing, I'm not really seeing a lot of connections. I guess the information that you kind of gather as you're processing records are ones that can be included in things like online collections and other access tools that archives make to provide access to digital records. So you can kind of reuse that descriptive information for things like online collections that your researchers will be using to access the records. Okay, so yeah, again, that's the ingest stage. The whole idea is to get the records from the records creator, transfer them to your archive, and then transfer them to storage for long-term preservation and access. And how smoothly that goes really can be set by things like working with donors before the records are even ingested, to develop a relationship with them and get an idea about what what the records are, the context of the records, do some initial appraisal, and it can be really valuable to have a good negotiation with records creators and donors as well, just to really make sure that the records coming into your archive are ones that your archive is going to be able to sustainably care for and provide access to into the indefinite future. And the level of appraisal and the quality of appraisal and the level of negotiation and the quality and meaningfulness of the negotiation can really echo throughout the transfer, ID and analyze, and accessibility stages. So it's just so important to get off on the right foot and not really find yourself falling behind to where you're accepting file formats or physical media that are difficult for your archives to handle. You don't want to be in the point where you're accepting records that don't have metadata associated with them, either because it didn't exist or it wasn't included with the transfer. And so you're just trying to figure out what all this stuff is and what you need to do to preserve it. So again, the first couple of steps are very crucial towards to having a nice, smooth ingest, and that's going to make it more likely that you're able to carry out your digital preservation in the long term in a way that is sustainable and doesn't require more resources than your archives has to devote to digital preservation. So again, if there's one thing to learn about really all forms of preservation, but especially digital preservation, is being proactive is just so important. And hopefully this lecture has reinforced that for you to a fair degree. So thank you for listening. As always, please let me know if you have any questions, and I will be more than happy to answer them as best I can. Take care, and I will talk to you soon.